My name is Mohit. My presentation is on different strategies that you could take to migrate to Jetpack Compose. So, in this presentation, what I'm going to talk about are how do you migrate to Compose if you have a large code base, and what are the tools that you could use to solve different problems, and most importantly, is that how do you go about thinking about your migration, and how do you go about planning it? So um, let's talk about the challenges, the different types of challenges that you could encounter, and depending on the code size that you're working with. So suppose that you were working on an app, and when you work on any type of application, it starts off as a greenfield project. It starts off as something that's really small, and then over time, as your team grows, as your it gets more complex, and you might be in a situation where you're working on an app, building an app from the ground up, from scratch, and that's called a greenfield project. And in a greenfield project, it's much more simpler to use Compose, because you're starting from scratch. You don't have to think about interruptibility with existing code. You have fewer roadblocks. But when you have a much more larger code base, like a huge code base, and you have to think, you have these different challenges that you have to think about. It's not just converting, one after the other. You need to think about a lot more things. So in this presentation, what I'm going to concentrate on is what are the things to think about when you're working on a very large code base. So when you think about, you want to create a roadmap where you start from zero, and at some point you'll get to 100%. And it won't be like in 1 month. When you're working on a very large code base, getting to 100% could take, years. And but along this road, you're going to have different types of roadblocks that you want to first brainstorm on and think about, and how you're going to overcome them. You want to think about that. So it's a really long road when you have a large code base, and there will be obstacles along the way. So the question is, what are those obstacles that could happen? So one of the big problems that I've experienced from working on very large code bases is that there's fragmentation. What that means is that you have this large code base, which is represented by this circle, but then you have these pockets, different pockets of code, where you have legacy code that might be architected like an MVC or MVP, and then you have these other features that might be architected in some new form of architecture, and they could be like different applications. So you have this fragmentation of your architecture, of like an overall architecture, and migrating to Compose in each of these areas has its own set of challenges. And because some of the areas may require a large refactor that you have to think about. So fragmentation is one big challenge in a very large code base. So where you could have like one area, one feature using MVVM, another one is using maybe MVI, and then how do you use Compose in those different areas of the code base? So one of the things that you want to think about, there is a lot of great tools provided by Compose for interoperability, to be able to work with the existing Android view system, and then to be able to use Compose with it. And Compose has really nice interoperability features that I'll go over in this presentation. And one thing to think about is that when you have a legacy area of the code base, and you want to inject in and like have as part of your XML layout some Compose code in there, how do you go about doing that? I'll go over that. So that's important. Interoperability is important. So another thing that that could happen, the other scenario is that you have some new compose that function you made, you want to reuse it in the legacy area of your code base. So how do you go about doing that? And we'll also look into that, which is, and the other part is, how do you may have a compose function, but you want to use some custom Android view that you made that you don't want to convert over to compose right away. So that's from your legacy custom view, you want to use it in compose, maybe some other area of your code base, and we'll look into how to do that. So the other big challenge is architecture. So legacy code. So people have legacy code for different reasons, and it's considered as legacy and for different reasons. So I want to share with you some of I have worked with a lot of legacy code in my past 10 years of Android, and I want to share some common legacy patterns that that require a lot more refactoring, which is, sometimes you may be using inheritance, not composition, where you're in composition, you're injecting dependencies, you're injecting your whatever your common logic is, and you may not be using that. Maybe a architecture that's built on inheritance. That's something that's very, very common in legacy code bases. So you may have, for example, I've seen very commonly in a lot, and is that sometimes you have like base fragments, and you have a multitude of fragments that are delegating some type of logic to it. So that's something that's very common in older code bases. And the problem with this is that when you were to convert one of these different fragments, it requires a lot more refactoring, a lot more work. And that's something that you want to consider in your roadmap to when you're adding compose. And similarly, like something similar is when you have like base view holders, you may have a lot of logic in your base view holders. You may have like a multitude of view holders that are they're inheriting from it. That's something that's very, very common to that I've seen in a multitude of code bases. So that in itself, if you were to convert a list, for example, which has the setup, it's very difficult to convert it to compose. So this is something very common that I've seen a lot. So the other part is, how do you go about converting your navigation? That's another challenge. So navigation, everyone sets up navigation differently. Navigation is part of your architecture, and everyone has some form of an abstraction for setting it up. And because there's so many different ways to set this up, and it's part of your architectural layer. So and when compose, the way you set up navigation, the way it's recommended is to use this nav host, where you specify all your different screens for this, and they're accessible using some form of a string, like a URI, for example, like profile friends list. But it's very difficult to really quickly to migrate to this. It takes a lot more effort. So you may have a legacy type of navigation where you have only activities in an app, and you're navigating from one activity to another. You could have like a navigator, a mechanism for that, and that makes it that has its own challenges of migrating this to compose. And similarly, some people have a code base where they have one activity and multiple fragments, so they may have one activity, but everything else is a custom view. They could be using the library like conductor, for example. And so navigation is very, very, very difficult. Something you want to think about in your migration plan, depending on your setup. So, and the last thing to think about is testing. So people, when you're in a large code base, you could have two different scenarios. One is that you already have a testing really good coverage, and that will really help you in your migration strategy. You may be all in the other scenario where you don't have a lot of code coverage at all, And it could be that you have 100% unit tests, but you don't have a lot of UI test coverage. And what are there are tools that with Compose that will help you to get coverage to catch regressions earlier that I'll show you. So these in the last challenge that I'll talk about is the tooling. Upgrading Kotlin becomes a challenge when you're using Compose. So because when you go from one version to another, you're going to see a lot of breaking changes, and I'll share with you some examples of that. So what I'm going to do in this talk, these are all the challenges that you will have in a really large code base. And I'm going to break down each challenge and then show you what tools you could use with Compose to be able to handle them. So when you're working in a large org, you usually have multiple different teams. You have your feature teams, you have an architecture team, a CI team, and you have a design team. And by design team, I don't mean designers. Design team, they're usually responsible for like working on like a common design component, common UI components. So they usually are responsible for design components, and they usually work on thinking about how do you bring about Compose. So it's a collaborative effort because these challenges they range from all these different teams. So I'll share with you what a design team could do if in a large company, what a design team does, could do in terms of migrating to Compose. So let's talk about the strategies to handle all these different challenges. When you step back and think about it, these are a lot of challenges that you have to consider when you're migrating to Compose, and when you're in a in a large code base. And because scaling problems are much more interesting, and intricate. So in this, when you go from zero to 100% at some point in the future, you want to set up milestones. You want to think about, well, what is the first milestone that I'll have, the second one, the third one. You don't have to, when you set up and plan your roadmap, you don't have to specify all the milestones. You want to specify enough milestones that that give you a good roadway, give you a good runway to run with it. And as you get hit maybe your second milestone, you want to go back and add more milestones, think about more, because you have a lot more like experience at that point, a lot more like on using Compose. So you what you want to start off with is a proposal. This is the approach a lot of people have been taking. A lot of people took when they introduced Kotlin, is that what is it going to be like? What are the milestones over time? And the most important thing is to assess the risk. If I were to convert something into Compose, what are the things that what are the risks? What are the bad things that could happen? And how do I catch them earlier? And in this proposal, you always also want to document. You're when you migrate something into Compose, you're going to come up with new patterns, and you want to migrate them along the way. You want to document them along the way. So let's start off with an example of a first milestone. So I'm going to share with you an example that a lot of companies have been taking, that you'll see on a milestone that you could have. So when you start off with your first milestone, you want to start off with not the highest complexity, because that has a lot of risk. You want to start in an area of your code base which is a low complexity. And one so what there are different types of low areas of your code bases, like for example, your settings. A lot of people have a debug panel in their code base that you could convert over. But and then you want to go in your migration phase 2 to your medium complexity features. So one thing that you could convert over, approach that a lot of people have been taking in the community, is to migrate over their design components. So when you're working on a large app, you have these multiple feature teams, or it could be multiple apps that are reusing some custom views, some that all these different apps like scaffolding, like a lot of these different apps are, or these features are reusing basically. And in a large company, a design team is the one that's responsible. They're the code owners of this common design components. So you may be in a mono repo where you have like different applications in there, and then all these different apps, or they could be in separate repos, and they are utilizing as an artifact, for example, these design components. That's an approach in a very large setting company that's taken, where you have these, and it's version, you have version 1, 2, and 3. So for these design components, so this design team is responsible for them, so they could think about, how would you convert over these common design components to compose. So that's a migration strategy that you could take when a first migration strategy. So what you want to do when you go about this is think about interruptibility, because these custom components, you're going to be, because in this scenario here, if you think about it, these apps here, they will be using the Android view system, and they need to be able to interact with like compose components, composable function. They need to be able to use them in their layouts. And how would they do that? So, so let me give you an example of the tools that Compose provides for interoperability with the Android view system. So suppose you have a sample UI like this, where you have basically a different sections. You have, this might probably be this is probably in an XML layout. Suppose part of it you want to convert to Compose. So this might be in an app which is in this constraint layout, and you want to convert these to the bottom of it, these text views and anything else in there to Compose. So what Compose provides you with is something called a Compose view, and that you could add into your XML layout, and you could tell this, hey, here is a composable function that I want you to call, then I want you to use to show the UI. So this is provided by the Compose library. And the way you set it up in your application is that you say, here, get the Compose views, call set content on it. This lambda of set content is composable. It has a composable annotation, and inside of it, you could add in whatever design component you want, like a reusable design component, for example. Like in this case, a description view that might be used in different areas of your code base. So when you do this, you have to think, there are challenges to doing this. You have to think about theming, interoperability with your themes, interoperability with the fragment lifecycle or an activity lifecycle that you have. So and how do you have to think about, when you're doing this piece by piece, how do you reuse existing dimensions and themes and strings? And in Compose, when you pose in this component, you could reuse some of the strings that you already have. Like, for example, I could call a get a string resource in this example. I could also specify a padding using reusing a dimension resource. And this is really good for doing things in different pieces and to Compose. So the other part is interoperability with the theming system. So when you create an Android Studio, if you create an empty Compose project, it creates a theme for you. But how do you utilize one that you already have as in your migration phases? So what you could do in order to reuse a theme is that Compose provides you with an adapter to be able to reutilize our current existing theme in an Android V system. And you could add this dependency as part of it. And then what you do is that rather than using the one that Android Studio auto-generated, you could use the MDC theme. And you could use this theme right here, and this will make sure that any of the code in this composable method utilizes the same colors and text as the theme that already exists. So you could have, so creating a theme, for example, it could be part of a secondary milestone as that the design system team could work on. So this is something MMDC theme is something that's provided to you by this dependency that you could utilize. So the other part, when you think about this, is that how do you get interruptibility with the life cycle of a fragment? For example, I want to dispose that composable in the fragment lifecycle. One of the really, really good practices that you always want to add when you're using this approach is to set a composition strategy to say that I want to dispose on view, treat, lifecycle, destroyed. And this is really going to help you. This is a really good recommended strategy that you always want to have. So that helps. This helps me to get interruptibility with the fragment lifecycle where I'm adding this. So when you those are the two different tools that you would want to use in your first milestone to be able to use some common design components in an Android in apps that have like that's using the XML layouts. So doing this is also a lot of work when you think about it when you're converting your common design components. But this is a really good starting point. And the next part is when you're as you're doing this, how do you document this basically? And this is the really, really most important part is document how to use these compose functions. This is also really good for onboarding. And there's a tool that Airbnb has. And thank you to Airbnb for creating this really nice annotation processor that allows you to document your design system that's written in Compose. And it's called Showcase. So this library here, the way it works is that like every app has some form of, I'm sure it has some form of you have some form of an internal drawer, right? And what you could do in order to go to a like a design spec of all your composable views that you made, you could create a button called Show UX. And what Showcase does is that it auto generates an activity and it lists all the components that you made. It lists all the colors. It lists all the and the typography. So this all the design in your design system. So the way it works is that it uses KSP and it auto generates a design spec. And the way you go about adding it to your code base is that first you add this root module, and from after adding this root module, you go and build your app, and then it auto generates this method, get browser intent. It will auto generate the activity, and then you could open it up from your debug panel, for example. So the way you could specify, like you could create different groups. You could have like different views that are for different features, like for reusability. You could specify under which group that it's part of using this in your preview annotation. And the way groups thinks is that it reads from this annotation basically. When does this is the way, like this name and group is the way that it goes about creating this screen over here, components, colors, and topography. And this is very, very useful. So this is what it would look like. So you will render basically what that compose method will show you. It will give you a preview of render it. It will show you. You could also add in an example of how to use that compose method in here. So this is really good as you're converting to like compose to be able to document your design system. Um, that I recommend using this tool. So the other thing that I want to share, so that's an example of what you could do, approach you could take in your first milestone. Um, the next step that I want that when you go over this milestone and you're thinking about what are some more much more complex features that have much more complexity than the app in your app you want to convert. It may be in a legacy area or non-legacy area. So the other thing that I want to show you is that suppose that you have different areas in your code base that are already in Compose, and you want to reuse a custom view that's in the legacy area of your code base. How do you go about doing that? So Compose provides you with an interruptibility feature, and it's called Android View. So this is a composable method, and inside of here, I'm provided a factory that I could where I could use a Android view, basically, not a compose view. And this is a custom view that I may have in some legacy area that I don't want to convert at all to Compose that might go away in the future. And I can specify here layout params or like any styling that I want. So this is really helpful for interoperability with legacy things. So we looked at these two examples of using these two things. These are really important things that will help you in this journey of using Compose, migrating to Compose. So this is something that a lot of people take in large, code bases to convert over, their design components. Another milestone? So another milestone when you go over this, as I shared, you want to think about what medium complexity features that you could convert. And the most important thing as you go about converting medium complexity features is to think about testing. Do you have testing infrastructure set up to catch regressions earlier? You may or may not. You could have like a lot of unit tests but no UI tests, for example. If you're I want to cover what you could do if you're in any of those situations. So suppose you're in a situation where you don't have any coverage at all. You don't have any, for example, UI tests, for example, at all. And how do you set up the scaffolding to catch different regressions? So let me show you what tools you could use for testing and how you could set up like a testing infra for Compose. So you want to catch regressions earlier. That's the goal of the setup. And there are two things that you could do, two approaches you could take, which is one is to set up snapshot testing, another one is to do UI testing with Espresso. There's interoperability provided for that for Compose. When you think about snapshot testing, it's very difficult to set up. There are lots of tools out there, and it's flaky. But there is one tool that a friend of mine made, which is really nice. It's called Paparazzi, and what a name for a library. So in this library, it's basically you could do snapshot testing without running, basically, as it says here, without like running it on an actual app or an emulator. You could generate a screenshot, and it uses the same logic that Android Studio uses. So how do you go about this? Is a really nice library, and how do you go about using this? So what it does is that it basically in a unit test, when you run that unit test, it will generate a screenshot for you that you could do, assertions again, look at before and after. It has Compose support and also has support for XML. So most recently, a Compose support was added, so you have to use the 1.0 snapshot version of it. So the way you set it up is that you use a rule called paparazzi, and then you could set up basically any type of configuration you want or any type of device that you want to generate a snapshot with. So what you do is that it has a method called paparazzi.snapshot, and then in the Lambda, you provided some fake UI state that you want to generate a snapshot for this composable. And what you will do is that it will store and you could use git LFS to store basically that snapshot of how it looks, and you could compare it the before and after. So this also has XML support. So when you're migrating, this is really useful for you to detect regressions and then do a before and after in XML and in Compose when you did the conversion in your PR. So like it will generate an image basically, and you could store using git LFS. So this is you could store and get these snapshots. So this library called Paparazzi is something that's really very useful. I have used it, and it does have some limitations that you could check out. The next thing that I want to talk about is UI testing interop. So you might be in a situation where you could be in two different situations where you have some espresso tests, UI tests, or you have none at all. And what are some interoperability, tools that are provided by Compose? So suppose that when I did this conversion and I want to add some tests for this, for example, this part of the UI that's in Compose. And when Compose, the way you go about testing this is that Compose creates a semantic tree and a set of nodes, and I'm able to basically go in the semantic tree, and I could say for this specific node, does it have a specific text or not, or maybe it's a button. You could do assertions on a specific nodes in this semantic tree. So Compose provides you with a rule that you could use in your espresso tests when you're testing just Compose related code. So you use this rule, and then you could go and traverse that tree and find which node do you want, and you could do an assertion on that. So this is really useful for having updating your espresso test. So the other case is that you may have like some Android view level code in your composable methods. How do you go about testing that? And you could basically, for example, you may have a piece of UI where you're doing some action on a button, for example, and you want to do an assertion on an Android view, which is not composable, and you could use expresso.onView as you normally do. So there is interoperability in both cases. So this is something really, really helpful. And the purpose of setting this up is that you want to catch, and very important to catch problems earlier in the conversions. Otherwise, it does not look good. Uh, and that's something that I recommend to set up that scaffolding for these different types of tasks using these different tools with Compose. So this is something that's really helpful, and setting this up is something that you may want to do, for example, early on in your journey, setting up your, if you don't have it, setting up some form of infrastructure for your testing, or like integrating these tools like paparazzi, for example, that would be really helpful. So next thing that I want to talk about is a problem that a lot of apps have, which is internationalization, something I've worked on at so many different places, where what it is that when you're working on a large app, you probably have it where it supports like a multitude of languages, for example. And how do you go about, it's how do you go about, what does that mean in Compose, and how do you go about interacting with your current existing setup that you may have? So usually you have like a lot of different languages, and how do you go about choosing which one to use? If you like convert something in Compose, how do you use this? So usually the flow that a lot of people have is you have some form of strings that you're adding to a translation service, could be like SmartLink, for example. And you basically, in SmartLink, someone reviews it and then it provides you translative its services. This is a very, very common setup. And how do you go about using these translated strings, right? It's a lot of work to refactor that whole thing. It would be a lot of work. How do you get interoperability? And there's a tool. This is kind of a tool that I would make if I was working on thinking about this problem. There's a tool. It's a compiler plugin, and it's called Lyricist, and it's really, really nice. It's similar to what is a multi-platform library, which is really nice, and it has Jetpack Compose desktop support. So what this is that it interacts with your current existing languages that you have. So strings that you have, and what it does is that the compiler plugin, it generates from those existing XML strings that you have for each language, it converts them to a type that you could use in your Compose methods. And what it does is that it creates a composition locale, a provider, that in which you'll be able to access in your composable code any language that you want. It's able to handle it. And really nice thing is that it's using types to be able to handle this. So what it does is that suppose you have an example where you have an English and you have another language that you have added. And I want to be able to, what does it look like if you were to add this tool with this setup? Suppose in one language you have some sample tools, you have an sample like strings, array of strings and plurals. And another for another language, you have the same things translated. So when you go and add this tool, this compiler plugin, you give it the path of that resource, and the reason why is that so that it could process them and then auto generate a strings type for you. And what it does is that it auto generates for each of your strings, like the actual string that you have, any arrays, any plurals, and it does that for a number of locales that you could configure. So this string type is what you would use in your composable code. And the next thing that it does is that it creates a provider, composition locale provider. So to be able to access basically these strings that you want in your compose code. So how does it look? Suppose I'm working on some composable method and I want to be able to support different types of languages. So I could do remember XML strings, and then I could use this composition locale provider. And inside of there, I could do XML strings. Like, for example, I want to get a greeting string, and it will be based on the locale, it will just provide me with the one that I want. You could test this out in using this preview annotation. So you could say, here is like, this is what it would look in hello world, but if I do it in PT, for example, language, I could, see what it looks like in the preview. So this is something that's really, really common that comes up in a lot of different code bases. Something that a tool that that's really helpful for interoperability as you're migrating over to Compose. And this is something that you would want to incorporate in one of these different milestones. So another thing is that how many milestones that you have in this journey is dependent upon the complexity of your code base. You should not expect to get to 100% like, in 1 month or 2 months. In a large code base, it takes, there's a large effort involved, does take time. Another thing to note here is that as you're, doing this, you want to think about onboarding. So onboarding is critical because you want to be people, as you're in Compose, there's something called slot layouts. So scaffold is a slot layout. As you convert things to Compose, you'll be creating your own types of slot layouts. And that's something that you want to document. What you want to document is how do people use Compose in your code base, which might be different than, what patterns are there, might be different than another code base. That's the most critical thing to document as you're going about in this journey. So last thing I want to talk about is the tooling. The tooling is a challenge, and before even adding Compose, this is something that you want to do in the setup in the initial phases. How does the tooling affect build times? How does the tooling affect when you have a multi-module, really large code base? What does it have any effect on the build tools? You want to benchmark that. So one of the biggest problems that you'll experience, that you'll see in the community that comes up, is that it's very difficult to upgrade Kotlin. So Kotlin 1.6.20 came out, but I can't upgrade it to that because the Compose compiler has not been updated. There's one thing I just want to add to the onboarding, is that the most critical thing to people understand about Compose is that it's not just the UI toolkit, it's a compiler plugin. It could be used for things that are outside of UI work. And that's something that you want to critically understand in Compose. So when you look at Compose, so that's one of the biggest problems, is that you can't upgrade Kotlin, very you have to wait until Compose gets upgraded. And there's a way to suppress this warning that they provide you, but it's not really, I don't recommend it at all. So the other thing is, so you want to wait for you have to wait for Compose to be updated. Now there is a Maven or repository. There's a Maven page that there's a Maven repository that provides you with Compose builds, very alpha Compose builds that have Kotlin version upgrade like 1.6.20 that you could test again. Before doing the upgrade, you want to test against these versions to see if you don't have any regressions, that you don't have any issues. So this is something that's very, very helpful. So another thing is that when you look at Compose, it gets upgraded. Their alpha releases upgraded like Alpha 6, Alpha 7, for example. And I have experienced sometimes those alpha releases causing regressions. For example, there's an issue right now where this issue is right now that came out where a lot of people brought it up. There's an open issue for this where the preview breaks. And the preview breaks in the recent version of Compose. And there's a workaround to this. So when this is from Stack Overflow, there's a workaround to this. But this is something that you want to catch earlier, these types of problems, the preview breaking. But this is, what to expect because it's early. So, for this library. So it's very, very important to, before doing upgrades, just to catch, these problems much more earlier. To test out, different new version upgrades. And so lastly, so I shared with you in this, presentation about how to think about migrating Compose, what problems could happen. And these are the common problems you'll have in any type of code base, from, dealing with different languages like internationalization, from dealing with testing to interruptibility, etc. I hope that was helpful for you. Lastly, I want to say that if you're looking for mentorship of any kind, I've been mentoring a lot of people. A lot of people on Twitter have been DMing. So it's been great to meet new people around the world and help them on learning Compose and migrating to Compose. If you're looking for mentorship in any areas, from Kotlin, Gradle, if you're looking for tutorials, you could check out my website, codingwithmohit.com. I give a lot of presentations on coroutines. That's where my expertise is. So if you're looking for help with that. Lastly, I want to say thank you to Shalom and to the Android Worldwide organizers for this opportunity to speak here once again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, Mohit. That's another one down.
Another one down. Just need water.
All right, folks, anybody have questions? Please feel welcome to post them. We have one here, but before we start answering Gabor's question, let's give another minute for other people to post questions, so we don't have people needing to manage whether or not they're choosing between writing a question or listening to your answer. So do you have to go through two separate processes for GDE Kotlin and GDE Android, or is it like one process that then you can expand out from?
To be a GDE, if you already are a GDE in a specific category, if you want to be a GDE for another category, there is only one interview rather than 3 interviews. That's the difference.
Nice.
Obviously, you're evaluated. You have to fill out a form, show your contributions in the community. You're evaluated whether your contributions are enough for that category. So it's the same evaluation process.
Interesting. You're the pro. Okay, we can start with questions now. Gabor's question. Before that, there was somebody who posted. I forgot. Sorry, I removed your question, but somebody wanted you to post. Maybe do it in the chat. Your website.
Sure.
But otherwise, then you can proceed on with Gabor's question.
Where's the chat? Oh, thank you, Mr. Gabor. Okay. Well, to answer this question, it says, is there any specific verifiable benefit to migrating from a pre-existing navigation solution, such as Jetpack navigation plus fragments, to be using the new string-based navigation compose? So, I know why you're asking that question. Is there benefits? Well, the one benefit is that, I mean, if you think about it, well, one is the setup. You have each screen is a composable method, and in order to follow that pattern, that's one benefit is to is reasoning about your code. You have everything, which is a composable method. You have a set of screens that you can navigate over to. Um, that's yeah. So that's all I have to say there. Not really a satisfactory answer. Well, next question is, in your experience, what's the best way to convince management to move towards Compose? That's a great question. So, uh, it's a Compose. The benefit that it provides is that it makes it easier to build UIs really fast, and you could like create a proof of concept really fast. Um, So it's kind of like the same. It's the same reasoning with Kotlin. Kotlin, allows you to go really fast. You know how to write less verbose code. Um, I think it's that, and also makes it easier to make complex, UIs. So there is sometime maybe there is a one way is to set up. You could set up a you could create a time metric that calculates the time. But the problem with that approach is that there's so many variables that could affect that. I think it's convincing management is difficult because you have to have strong engineering culture, where you has to be bottom up, where you're trusting engineers. So we're using this technology because in your proposal, you want to write out why does it help with improving developer speed. I don't think, in my opinion, it has to be there has to be a metric to convince someone. I mean, you want to put forward a good argument, and most importantly is assessing the risk. And that's a good way. Best way to convince management is that obviously you're using this technology that just came out. What are your different ways that you're going to mitigate those risks, and you have a good plan forward. And that was the gist of my presentation, basically. Hope that answered your question. Oh well. Next question we have is, why do we need a library like Lyric if I use string rows? Would it not use the correct localized string? Well, I mean, that's a good question. So it would use, your localized stringage, but this just provides really nice type safety. So you don't have to use a string resource, just another pattern that you could use. That's the benefit of it. It has nice support with multi-platforms, so you could use it for another platform if you want the same type of a pattern. That's the benefit. You don't have to use that library, obviously, but it's a good possible solution. That's next question that we have is from when building an app from scratch, Compose seems to stray away from fragments. Are there any drawbacks to using standard activity fragments set up with the Compose view instead implemented? Can I still benefit also from scaffold and slots? So When building, let me read that again. When building an Android app from scratch, Compose seems to stray away from fragments. Are there drawbacks to using standard activity fragment setup with the Compose view implemented in OnCreate, and I still benefit from also using? So, are there drawbacks to using? There aren't drawbacks to using standard activity fragment setup. Um, you could still have that set up, but you still have to like add in for interruptibility, for example, view dispose, for example, that strategy. um, can I still benefit from scaffold and slots? I mean, yeah, you could still benefit from slots and create your own. You could set them up in your on create view. So that's my answer to that. So the next question: how stable is Compose now? How much time should I expect to spend refactoring when I upgrade to newer versions? So in my experience, upgrading to newer versions, I haven't had to do a large refactoring when upgrading from one Compose version to new version to another. So it is stable now, but there are obviously updates, alpha updates that come out regularly to fix bugs. uh how much time should how much time should I expect to spend on refactoring? It depends on your code base and how complex it is and what you're looking to migrate over to. uh, when you upgrade to newer versions, you shouldn't have a lot of problems. Then when you go alpha oh 05 to say alpha oh 06, there weren't any lot of breaking changes from my experience. That's my answer to that. Um, Next one: does Compose, in your experience, provide enough of a development velocity boost that it balances out newly introduced tooling issues that arise? What a question! Nice question. And the version lock of the compiler plugin. Um, yeah. So when I weigh those two things, the tooling issues, I haven't seen a lot of tooling issues where it's breaking. So does Compose, in your experience, provide enough of development velocity boost? I think you have to measure that over time, and so in order to get a really good picture of it. So when you're just starting out converting like small things, it's hard to have a measure metric like to have enough data where it's improving your developer velocity or not. It's much used, yeah. So that it takes answering that question, like whether it improves, you have to that's something that you want to measure as you're going from one milestone to the other, and you want to have something in place that allows you to measure that. So that's my answer to that question. How to approach the paradigm shift in the team from traditional ways of doing UI. So that's a big challenge. One thing that you could do is that you want to something that's really helpful. Like if you have a smaller team, which works well, is that you set up bi-weekly some meeting where everyone together works on migrating over some area of the app, and and that's something that's really useful to learn how to get everyone and to learn how to think about and doing in a declarative way, to spread the knowledge. And that's something that you want to have as part of like your onboarding flow, or a set of tutorials you want to have documentation on, which really helps someone to learn before they're going into this area of the code base, help them to learn from how to think about, and what is the mind, how to think differently in declarative UI programming. So it's something I do is to teach one-on-one, basically, whoever wants to learn. and that really helps. That works in a small team. And a large team is difficult, where in a large team you want to have some form of knowledge base that someone could go to if they're going to work in an area of Compose. Onboarding is really a dynamic process that that you want to put in place, basically, uh, as you're converting things to Compose. That's my answer to that question. That's it. No more questions. Thank you all for your questions. I hope I answered them to the best of my ability. If not, you could Slack me in the Android Worldwide Slack community, and I'll just get back to you, help you in any way to migrate to Compose. Almost, yeah, that's it.
Sweet. Thank you, Mohit.